Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here, and there's no question about it. I'm definitely taking you back to school this morning, and glad to have the opportunity to do it. And we're going to move into the digital age, too, which is something Billy mentioned. So across the state, at these regional schools, each of the presentations is going to be a bit different. And what the agents in this area asked for is some emphasis on how you manage soybeans differently in some of our different yield environments. So I will get into some of that material later in this lecture, but if we look at this North Carolina regional soybean school model, one of the real goals that Billy just emphasized was that we'd be able to go more in depth on some material. For me, that's going to be core agronomic material. For my colleagues and other presenters, it will be other material. But in this presentation, my objectives today are to take a deep dive into the important agronomic considerations for soybean yield. There's not time to talk about all the considerations, so I'm going to talk about planting date and maturity group and how you might adjust those across yield environment. I'll talk about how those production practices again impact soybeans in high yield environments and lower yield environments. And then a critical thing that we want to do in our winter meeting program this year is highlight a decision support tool that will be released publicly on April 1st that will allow producers to make more data-driven decisions about these agronomic practices and their interactions with soybean yield. So if you followed along at all with the soybean extension program over the past few years, you know that we look at the yield contest entries to identify the production practices that are the strongest predictors of high yield. And if you think back to that analysis, there's 3 production practices that have really emerged to the top as consistently impacting soybean yield. Do y'all remember what those are? And I'm just going to tell you, I teach classes on campus, and I'm very used to just waiting until someone comes up with something. But I heard somebody.
Planting date.
Okay, planting date's one of them. Foliar fungicide and maturity group. And so those are the 3 strongest predictors of high yield that have consistently emerged when we've looked at these yield contest entries. Today I'm going to focus on planting date maturity group. I will mention foliar fungicides later in the presentation, but if you're interested in learning more about these production practices and how they interact with soybean yield in these high yielding situations, and also what production practices we haven't seen have a large impact on yield in high yield environments, that QR code will take you to a chapter in the NC Soybean Production Guide that talks a lot more about this. But we're going to deep dive this morning into soybean planting date and soybean maturity group. So if you look in the Ag News, I did like a quick search when I was putting this presentation together about early soybean planting date. And this is all over the news, emphasized all over the Midwest, Mid-South, Southeast, an emphasis on planting soybeans earlier. And if you look at the data-driven information that drives that, across the U.S., we looked at soybean planting date several years ago and their influence on yield. And it was found over that 10-year period that if growers had planted 12 days earlier, it would have resulted in a 10% greater yield across the U.S. for soybeans. In the Southeast, it was 30 days. So our average soybean planting date is somewhere around late May. We could be planting a lot earlier than that to try to capitalize on some of those yield benefits. If you look at this map, this shows across the U.S. kind of the yield implications of delaying soybean planting from May 1 to May 31. And the severity of doing that differs across the U.S. For us, it's about a 4% yield loss when you delay from May 1 to May 31 based on this data. But for other states like Illinois, it'd be a 15% yield loss. They don't have the temperatures to drive vegetative growth like we do. And so I think if you look across the U.S. and you look at this map in some of these states, you're losing 15 to 20% of yield by delays in planting from May 1 to May 31. You can easily see why there's this emphasis on trying to get soybeans planted earlier. Knowing there's an emphasis in that area, you've likely heard that our program had generated research working with the risk management agency to try to get the early replant coverage date moved for soybeans in North Carolina. And it was moved to April 1st across the state. So your replant coverage date is no longer the 21st or the 15th of April. You can plant starting April 1st and get replant coverage from the federal government, just because there's such this emphasis on early soybean planting. But today in this school, I really want to talk about what are the data-driven mechanisms that we can use to actually pick the best planting date. Yes, there's a lot of information in the ag media. Yes, we've gotten some policy change to try to facilitate earlier soybean planting dates, but what planting date should we actually be using in our different environments? So to go back to the fundamentals, who remembers this graph? This is one of Dr. Dunphy's. He's always talking about, like, we want to get the soybeans to lap the middles. And I'll say that, and my colleagues in other parts of the U.S. are like, what are you talking about? I'm like, essentially, like, you want the beans to be at canopy closure. And if you don't get there, then you're going to lose yield. So in this very simple graph, you can see on the x-axis if we've got earlier planted beans to later planted beans. This is percent of max yield. At some point, if you've lapped the middles and they've gotten tall enough, you're at maximum yield potential. And we'll look a little more data on that in just a moment. But why do we need to get there? You need to build the factory, the vegetative factory, to drive yield. And on average, when you look at soybeans planted across the U.S., you add one new node every 3.7 days after the first trifoliate leaf appears, so V1, up to the reproductive growth stages. So if you're planting earlier, you have more days to put on more nodes before the plant moves into reproductive development. That's one of the primary reasons that there's been all this interest in earlier soybean planting dates. I will also just mention that particularly in the Midwest, the breeders are breeding varieties to perform more optimally in early planting situations. So there's efforts to push the genetics in these early planting situations because there's all this interest. So I talked about the importance of soybeans lapping the middles, and I just want to look at a little more data that we've generated recently in 5 years, 2019 to 2023 across the state, so recent information. On the x-axis, we have plant height here. On the y-axis, we have yield. So this is the relationship between plant height and yield. And basically what we found, which verifies some of the earlier information, is that once you get to about 36 inches, which is 3 feet, there's kind of a plateau and even a decline in yield at these higher plant heights. So you do need a certain amount of plant height, but we found it's about 36 inches. Over that is excessive often and can have negative yield implications when the plants get too tall. So you have to build the factory up to a certain point to drive yield. Now, I want to talk about this in a little more depth. So this is a lot of research here, 5 years, 20 sites across the state exploring the relationship between soybean planting date and yield in North Carolina. Here on the x-axis, we have planting dates. In our trials, we plant from mid-March, which at the time we started this, I think we thought was early. We probably should have started in the beginning of March in retrospect. And we went all the way into early August with our planting dates. So x-axis, planting date. Y-axis is yield. I want to talk about the trends that we saw for the optimum planting dates in North Carolina. This is combined over a lot of locations and a lot of yield environments, but just on average, what do we find? The single planting date, if you had to pick one that maximized North Carolina soybean yields, was May 1 across all these sites. You can see the lines pretty flat from about April 20 to May 20. So that's our optimum planting window if you had to make a broad generalization across the state. I think we would all expect to see yield declines as planting date is delayed. Maybe not yield declines, you know, after May 20. If you looked at Dr. Dunphy's optimum planting period, it was May 1 to June 10. We can't go past late May without losing yield anymore on average, and that's because there's more aggressive management and there's better genetics. So we can't wait until mid-June anymore. We got to get it done by my 3rd week of May on average across our yield environments. So we'd expect to see these yield declines with later planting, you know, when you get past mid-June down into mid-July. But one thing I don't think we really expected when we went into this data set to see is that we also saw lower yields when you were planting before mid-April. If you think about all the literature across the U.S. talking about early soybean planting, it's pretty much they're talking about a linear decline in yield as planting date is delayed. But we're not seeing that in North Carolina, regardless of whether it's a high yield environment or a low yield environment. Now I will say in high yielding situations like this, there are parts of North Carolina where you can get away with early planting without as much yield risk. So any idea where we might have seen these pretty consistently?
Piedmont.
Not the Piedmont generally. It's the Blacklands. Little warmer, pushes vegetative growth a little harder earlier in the season. So that's where we've seen less yield implications from early planting than other parts of the state. But since this is a soybean school, I want to go into a little detail about what is dragging yield at planting dates before mid-April in North Carolina. So what do y'all think are some risks to planting before mid-April? That's what we'll define as early planting. Okay, seed quality. Can I not make it any easier? But I got like 6 more things on the list.
Take a minute of time in mind before they do what they've done right there.
Okay. Other populations. Okay. Well, yes, we have to ensure we have the right populations.
Frost freeze.
Okay, frost freeze. We're going to talk a little bit about that. That is a risk. Okay, it's wet and cold, and what kind of issues does that cause? Okay, slow emergence, which can intensify early season pathogens. It can slow herbicide metabolism in the plant, which can cause some cosmetic issues. It can also reduce population, so that's a good point, Al. So let's talk through some of these. First of all, plant death due to freeze or frost. This is often like one of the first things that people mention as a risk in early planting. And I will say it is a risk, but we've been doing this research on early planting all across the state past 5 years, 20 sites across the state. We've started in mid-March, which is pretty early. These beans have encountered some pretty cold conditions. At only 1 site have we actually seen plant loss due to cold conditions. We are counting the plants, so we know. And that was in Yadkin County out towards the mountains. We lost about 30% of our stand in 1 year. But other than that, we've seen really minimal implications of plant death due to freeze or frost in those early planting situations. Now we can see cosmetic injury that kind of looks like bleaching on the cotyledons, but we really haven't seen a lot of circumstances where we've encountered a lot of freeze or frost. Yes, it's a risk to early planting, but I don't think it's one of the biggest risks we encounter in North Carolina. If you think about it, there's a lot of beans getting planted in the upper Midwest in April, and it's a lot colder there than it is here. So beans are pretty resilient and planted in the cold conditions, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Cool soils, which was mentioned, can synergize other issues like early season pathogens. That's why, as a side, our small plot data recently shows if you're planting before mid-May, you really need a fungicidal seed treatment on the seed to protect against stand and yield in those early planting situations. We've seen some differences in early season insect pressure with beans planted before mid-April. For example, we've seen high levels of bean leaf beetle pressure. We've seen kudzu bug pressure on the early planted beans, which would merit an insecticide application. So I think that's a risk that can be managed, but nonetheless, early planted beans have to be scouted, and that has to be managed early in the season, which isn't our standard production practice. And I think one of our biggest yield limitations from these early planting situations is, in fact, that we get less vegetative growth than you do with a more moderate planting situation before the beans move into reproductive development. And that is totally counterintuitive. Like when we went into this research, we had a ton of questions like, if you're planted mid-March, the beans are going to get so tall, they're going to lodge, it's going to be problems. But we have consistently, over the past 5 years, seen that our beans planted before mid-April are some of our shortest beans. Often they're not even as tall as our double crop beans. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. One is that we don't have temperatures driving vegetative growth in March and April like we do in May and June. And when you plant beans before mid-April, how early do you think that those can flower? Planting in let's say you're planting April 1st. How early do you think those beans can flower?
1st of June.
1st of June. Other ideas? So on our earliest planted beans, we've seen beans flowering in North Carolina by May 5th, May 6th. Those are for early maturing varieties, but even for the later maturing varieties, they can be flowering by late May, and if they're already moving into reproductive development at that point, they haven't had temperatures to push vegetative growth like they do when you're planting in May or June. So I think that's a real risk to really early planting in North Carolina, and also problems on the back end of the season, which we just discussed, and I'll mention in a few moments. So let's talk about that first risk, which is freeze or frost killing soybean plants. And if you look in the literature in the Midwest, where they have a lot of experiences with that, and I know we've had beans killed in North Carolina from cold conditions as well, but the research shows that you really need to drop below 28 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 or more hours to kill a soybean plant in the young growth stages. And we're just not often seeing those production situations, even in our early production circumstances. And there's certain stages where the beans are really susceptible to cold injury, like right there when the new growth is emerging out of the cotyledons. They're pretty susceptible in that stage. But at other stages, they're pretty robust against cold injury. So those cotyledons are filled with water, and they kind of like act like an antifreeze. So if they're protecting the new growth, beans can really withstand cold conditions without seeing plant loss. But if you were planting that early, which is not going to be our recommendations for most environments, but if you needed to plant that early so that you weren't pushing planting behind tobacco or peanuts or whatever, then our recommendation after a cold snap is you wait for several days before you make a decision about replanting. And if you, even if it killed some of the new growth off the cotyledons, the cotyledonary node can send out new growth after tissue has died in those circumstances. And so you really need to wait a few days before you make a replant decision following cold conditions. So in summary, yes, freeze and frost is a risk. It's not a risk we've realized very often in our early planting situations.
How much impact on yield have you seen?
From early planting?
Where you had fields that were frozen.
Yeah, it's a good question. So how much yield impact have you seen from these cold conditions? Well, first of all, I would say that's a very difficult thing to quantify, because I think cold conditions are impacting things like vegetative growth, disease pressure that we can't really quantify. But, well, you can look at the yield results, but you can't explicitly say what's driving that. We, again, only had one site where we saw a significant stand loss. And yes, there was yield implications at that site from losing that stand, for sure. Because it wasn't like, that was a site out in Yadkin County, there was a lot of residue. It wasn't like you lost 30% of the stand and that was every third plant. There would be like big areas where there was either a lot of residue or not residue, and you would lose stand in big patches. So it wasn't consistent, and it did have yield implications for sure. So to move on to another risk, which is any type of issues you might see early in the season, whether it's pathogens or insects from early season planting situations. I do just want to highlight, we have recently released a tool called Beans Gone Wild. How many of y'all have used Beans Gone Wild? Well, hopefully we can get some more folks using this. It was our pilot kind of beta testing year in 2023, but I think we're getting our feet under us in using this tool, and we're collaborating with some crop consultants across the state to do this tool. So it's definitely a public-private partnership to show the strength of the NC soybean sector, and this is supported by the NC Soybean Producers Association and the university. And what this is a dynamic map that catalogs soybean issues that are arising across the state. So you can see some of the things that are happening in real time. So if you were planting in these early planting situations, this map is going to be feeding in issues that you might see in those early planting circumstances. So I'll just throw this one up there as an example. This came in from Stan Winslow, who likely a lot of you know in this area of the state. And he's one of our core beginning collaborators on this tool. And this came in, bean leaf beetle pressure on early planted beans. Again, that's something we often see. And I think on your later planting dates, the beans grow out of this very quickly. But at these early planting dates, the beans are just growing much more slowly, and you see a lot more of the issues from herbicide injury or insect pressure that you might not notice as much in the later planting situation. So I did want to highlight there are some pests management risks and implications from early planting. You can learn some more about some of those in Beans Gone Wild and how you might manage those situations. And the last risk that I really want to highlight in relationship to early planting in North Carolina is the implications on vegetative growth in these really early planting situations. So these pictures are from the coastal plain, lower Sampson County. But if you look at this, here's our different planting dates. We usually are targeting the middle of the month, but logistics, you know, that doesn't always happen. But March, April, May, June, and July, those are our planting dates at this site. And you can see, just like when we looked at the relationship between yield and planting date, it was a quadratic curve. We see the same thing with plant height, where your earliest planted beans are actually some of your shorter beans. I mean, they're a little taller than the July planted beans, but they're not taller than the June planted beans. Now, they have a decent pod load, but we're definitely consistently seeing a lot more plant height from our April and May planted beans than our really early planted beans. And that's a picture of what that looks like. Here's some data on the x-axis. Here we have our maturity groups. On the y-axis, we have plant height, and these different colored line represents our different planting dates. So this blue is our mid-March to early April planting date. I think going into this, a lot of us would have guessed those would have been your tallest beans, because you're thinking those are the beans that are going to get the most daylight before they start flowering. But again, we just haven't had the temperatures to drive vegetative growth in those really early planting situations. If you look at some of these others, the purple line is the mid to late April. The teal line is the early to mid-May. And I would just say, if you looked across the state at all these plots for the past 5 years, generally our early to mid-May planting dates have had the tallest beans, which is, I think, counterintuitive to what a lot of us would think. And then you have your July planted beans down here where you had the shortest plant height, and I think we would expect that. So there are definitely some risks to early planting. So we're talking about, in this lecture, a deep dive into soybean planting date. And one of the takeaways I'd really like you to leave here is we can plant too early in North Carolina in most situations, and that has negative yield implications for all the reasons that were just discussed. In high yield environments, which we'll talk about a little later in this lecture, there's a bit more flexibility on the early planting dates. And I think this is well known, but just to emphasize, we just talked a lot about the risks to early soybean planting. There are also yield risks to late soybean planting, which are well understood and revolve mostly around the inability to get enough vegetative growth to close canopy before these beans move into reproductive development. So kind of to recap our deep dive on planting date, the optimum planting period was previously defined as May 1 to June 10. That is no longer the case with our new genetics, more aggressive management. Depends where you are in the state, depends on your yield level or what type of stress the beans are going to encounter that environment, soil type. But somewhere between April 20 and May 20 is the optimum planting period, and we have some tools that are coming in April to help growers make better decisions within that planting period about what the best planting date would be to maximize yield. This is a good resource that's developed on some of these soybean planting date considerations. If you're interested, you can pull up the QR code, or just if you type Science for Success, which is a national initiative supported by the United Soybean Board, you'll come across a lot of these materials. So planting date was one of the core agronomic production practices that impact yield in high yield environments and low yield environments. And the other thing we wanted to do was a deep dive into soybean maturity group. So what is the primary thing that drives these different soybean maturity group categories? Hours of darkness. Okay, Al, that is more technically correct. You're right, but day length, photo period, that's what drives our maturity group zones. And if you think about that, soybeans are a night length sensitive crop, and so they're looking for a certain length of night to trigger flowering. So in this depiction here, you can have the critical length of night here, and that critical length of night changes depending on what your soybean maturity group is. When you don't have the critical length of night, the beans will not flower. When you've got it, they will flower. Temperature interacts with this, but this is a generalization. If you've got some interruption in night length, They will not flower. So what would be an example of an interruption in night length? Okay, night light, stop light. So I went to undergrad in Champaign, Illinois. If you've ever been up there, some of the best farm ground in the country. Like they are farming right up against the stoplights. And at the corner of those fields, a lot of times those beans haven't flowered because that light from the stoplight is interrupting their photo period. So you can think about soybeans are looking for a certain length of night to flower. Knowing that, these latitudinal zones were developed to say, okay, these are where soybean genetic package best fits based on that photo period. If you think about it, the earlier maturing varieties flower with a shorter length of night, or you can think they're less sensitive to night length because in the Midwest, in the summer, the days are longer. That's where the earlier maturing varieties have historically been grown. As you move towards the later maturing varieties, they will flower with a longer length of night. But the reason we can grow all these maturity groups in North Carolina is because we have the length of night to trigger flowering. The earlier maturing varieties flower with a shorter length of night. We have the longer nights and we will trigger flowering throughout the season. I do just want to highlight that is the historical way that maturity groups were defined. Kind of two things drive reproductive development in soybeans. Photo period or night length is important, but also temperatures interact with that. And temperatures have changed since that original map was developed in the 1970s. So this is kind of the new maturity group map of recent, if you consider the temperature changes. You still see North Carolina slated to optimally produce, a mid-5 to maturity group 6, and a lot of double crop data fed this map development as well as full season, but I think that's one of the reasons. But nonetheless, we know we produce a wide range of maturity groups in North Carolina. And we can't because we have the night length that'll trigger reproductive development across all these maturity groups. So what are some things that influence a maturity group selection?
Yield environment.
Okay, yield environment, yield potential, okay. What's your harvest timing? Maybe what's your rotational complexity and when can you harvest those soybeans? So those are some good ideas thrown out there. I think depending on what your planting date situation is can influence your maturity group selection. There's some interactions there. What's your rotational complexity? What's your desired variety source? I just list that. Does anybody grow organic beans in here? Or just sell conventional beans to Smithfield, for example? Anyways, depending on what your variety source is, it can, and what your end use is, it can narrow down what maturity groups you might use. Yield potential is a big one. I think that's a big reason we've seen a shift to earlier maturing varieties in North Carolina. And I do want to emphasize, I think one of the things that makes North Carolina soybean producers successful is that they're growing a range of maturities across a range of planting dates, which leaves us less susceptible to risk during any one individual period, which is important. If you think like a year like 2023, it wasn't a great weather year for soybean production. There was a lot of stress on those beans. And we are gonna cut close to average, close to record, if not at record, for average soybean yield across the state. And I think that's because we're using a diversity of production practices to manage risk, and that is important. But if we look at maturity group, in our high yielding situations, we know we're producing a wide range of maturity groups. One reason is yield potential. In that yield contest analysis I mentioned earlier, if you look across the state of North Carolina, we saw maturity group 4 and earlier soybeans average 73 bushels per acre. The later maturing varieties average 55 bushels per acre. So there's definitely yield implications in high yield environments. You might remember in that analysis we also did some regional analyses, and there are some differences between what we saw across the state. So I'm showing you the coastal plain data here. This is 238 entries out of the coastal plain across that time period. Slightly shifted later maturity groups. We saw maturity group 5 or earlier in the coastal plain average 69 bushels per acre, and the 6s and 7s, and frankly there are some 8s in there too, average 53 bushels per acre. So in your environment, earlier maturing varieties were still leading to higher yields, but it was 5s and earlier versus 4s and earlier like we saw in spots like the Tidewater region. So we know this is important in high yield environments. If you look at this figure.
Question.
Yes.
Dr. Vann, on your maturity groups, on the earlier maturing, are you adjusting your timing as far as fungicide usage compared to a later maturing group?
Yeah, it's a good question. So do you need to adjust your timing? Are you talking more broadly or in our research plots or what?
Broadly, all those contestants there.
Yes, that's a very good question. So do you need to adjust your fungicide applications if you're using an earlier maturing variety? So what we have seen, what we know is using these earlier maturing varieties, that robust foliar disease management is important if you don't have genetic disease resistance. And we found you think about the environmental conditions in North Carolina, often our foliar disease is not picking up till a little bit later in the season. So what we've found in the earlier maturing varieties is kind of maybe the R3 is more of the sweet spot, depending on your planting date, because they're going to be at different stages of reproductive development if you're planting a 3 in April versus in June. But we found the R3 would be the sweet spot. In general, I really think we have to get moving into more precision mechanisms to make disease management decisions, like we're doing spore trapping, we're climatic modeling. I think we got to move there instead of just being like R3 is the optimum growth stage. But I guess my point is, in a later maturing variety where you're pushing reproductive development later, maybe you can wait. Maybe you need to be more on that like R1, R2 end, and on an early maturing variety, you likely want to be a little bit later because the environmental conditions that drive disease often occur later in the season. But that's just kind of a broad generalization. So if you look at this maturity group, thank you for the question. On the x-axis, we have maturity group. On the y-axis, we have yield. And you see this decline in yield as maturity group increases. Okay? High yielding situations. Why do you think that's the case? Like, why are earlier maturing varieties maximizing yield in high yield situations?
Where's the market share for the companies?
Okay, yes. Where's the market share for the companies? Like, if I'm a breeder for Bayer, let's say, I'm going to be really focused on making sure my MG2s and 3s are awesome because they're grown in Iowa and Illinois where the vast majority of the market share is. That's a part of it. Other ideas? And that can be connected to one of the primary reasons. So if we think about what the plant breeders do every year to make genetic progress in whatever crop, it might be corn, it might be cotton, it might be peanuts, we're going to talk about soy. Every year, you can look at the progress that breeders are making, independent of intensified management, independent of changing weather conditions. What are the breeders doing every year? It's called what we call genetic gain. And if you look at this, this shows the genetic gain. These are in papers published by the breeders across the different maturity groups, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're going to look at genetic gain here over this 80-year period in bushels per acre per year. So in the earlier maturing varieties, they're making genetic progress each year of 0.34 bushels per acre. That's for the 2s and 3s. Let's look at the 6s. It's 0.2 bushels per acre per year. The 7s, it's 0.15 bushels per acre per year. So the genetics are better in the earlier maturing varieties, and that's because the breeders are really focusing on those areas of the country where we're producing most of those earlier maturing varieties. That's not to say we don't have great breeders in our environment. We do, and they're making a lot of progress. But if you look at the data, the genetic gain is greater for earlier maturing varieties. And particularly, they're breeding earlier maturing varieties to have better branching ability, to put more pods on branches, and to have the ability to compensate at low populations, essentially through both of those things. And so that's why you often see in these yield contest entries, the population's 80,000 seeds per acre. They're dropping the population low. The genetics have been bred to thrive in that environment. So I think when we look at these high yielding situations, again, one of the reasons the earlier maturing varieties perform more optimally is simply because the genetics can push harder in those high yield environments. I think an important thing to talk, especially to coastal plain growers, about when we think about maturity group are the seed quality implications. And we talked a little bit about this, but this is a major risk to producing earlier maturing varieties in our environment. And it's one of the reasons we often see a yield drag from really early planting dates in North Carolina. So this is all predictable coming out of the Mid-South where they were producing earlier maturing varieties 20 years ago. And there's well-documented issues associated with that when you have a lot of heat and you have a lot of high temps as the beans are moving into reproductive development. So Tristan Morris, can you wave, Tristan, and DJ Stokes, Dwight, some of our team members, either current or previous, have done a lot of work looking at how these maturity group and planting date interactions affect seed quality. And our team's trained by the graders that grade your beans when you take them to the elevator on how to quantify damage. So we might pull a sample from an early maturing variety planted before mid-April. Okay, this is obviously a severe circumstance, but you'll get the point. So that's a full sample. We'll pull out the damaged seed. We'll weigh it, just like they did at the elevator. We'll pull out the seed with purple seed stain. We'll weigh it and quantify it. And so we have a good pulse on how these production practices and these maturity groups are influencing seed quality. And what I can tell you over now 5 years of doing this research, that the 2s, 3s, and 4s consistently have more seed quality issues when they're planted before mid-May in our environment. And that's a risk, and I think something that needs to be discussed when you're thinking about using earlier maturing varieties. And I don't think it matters if you're in a high yield environment or a low yield environment. If you get a lot of rain and there's high temperatures when those beans are R6, R7, you're going to see seed quality issues. We have a lot of questions from growers about, can you intensify your management, whether it be with fungicides or insecticides, in the mid-reproductive growth stages, and try to prevent some of those seed quality issues that we encounter. Can that be managed through aggressive pest management? And we've done research on this over the past couple of years. We did it at 6 locations across North Carolina. In each location, we had 3 planting dates and we had 3 maturity groups, and we were trying to manipulate and make all these microenvironments where we were going to run into seed quality issues. I would say the past couple of years, because we've had a relatively dry fall and harvest season, haven't been the best years to investigate this. But essentially what we've found is using aggressive mid-season pest management has pretty low impact overall on damage. So here we did a fungicide at R3, insecticide at R3, fungicide at R3, R5, fungicide and insecticide at R3, R5. I mean, you're getting pretty aggressive with pest management there. We're looking at damage, we're looking at purple seed stain. Damage is the red bars, purple seed stains the blue bars. The untreated control is over here. So even with those aggressive levels of mid-season pest management, you're really not dropping damage generally. It's weather that's driving this. You generally cannot control the weather, and so that's a big risk to using these earlier maturing varieties. Whether you're in a high yielding situation or a low yielding situation, this is a risk I think that needs to be discussed when we talk about these maturity groups. So those are some of like the deep dives I wanted to do into planting date, maturity group, why they're important, some of the implications that they can have on yield. And now I want to shift into understanding, you know, right now, how do you make decisions about those production practices? Okay, rotational complexity. Thank you, Mitch. Okay, well, hopefully, part of what the role of NC State University is to conduct research that will give you unbiased information to make those decisions. And I want to talk about some research that we've done and some tools we have coming down the pipe to help make better decisions about those core production practices. So over the past 5 years, we've investigated fundamental agronomic impact on soybean yield. We're usually focusing on yield. We also quantify damage, like you just saw. We look at things like protein and oil, which could become increasingly important to you in the future, and we need to know how these production practices influence those, as well as some other things. But we've looked at a wide range of planting dates, a wide range of maturity groups, and a wide range of seeding rates all across the state past 5 years. So this has built a pretty big data set that I hope you will find valuable in making decisions on some of these things. And I just want to acknowledge over the past 5 years, a lot of work has gone into this, and farmers from all across the state have hosted our research, and it's not a small amount of research to host. So this has happened because of the generosity of the farmers. It's happened because of our excellent extension agents who have gone out to these plots. If you've hosted them, we've got several. Austin Brown, for example, has hosted these. If you got these plots, you're going out there a lot to give us feedback and help move the bar forward. So it's a big team that have generated these results. And I'm going to show you right now quickly a pretty static graph that's been generated out of this research looking at high and low yield environments. And then we're going to talk about how you could use this data more meaningfully. So on the x-axis, we have our maturity groups. On the y-axis, we have yield. The different colored bars are the different planting dates. And I just am showing you this to give you an example of the nuances between these management practices in high yield environments and low yield environments. So these are our high yield environments. And if you look at the red line, there's a lot going on here. Let's pay attention to the red line. If you look at the red line, that's mid to late April planting, which in our high yield environments maximize yield. Not that different than what we saw from the yield contest analysis. And there we had our 4s and 5s being some of our top yield performers in a high yielding situation, more consistent with what we've seen with the yield contest analysis. Let's look at a lower yielding situation. The red line is still mid to late April planting. But in those production circumstances, it was the later maturing varieties and the late maturing varieties that maximized yield in our lower yielding circumstances. So there's some nuances, there's some complexity to this, and that's why we have a tool that's coming to help you make better decisions. I'm going to just quickly make a mention about foliar fungicide use, which we've talked about. Very consistent producer-derived data, small plot data. Foliar fungicide use protects yield in North Carolina soybean production if you don't have the genetics that confer resistance to your problematic diseases, let's say frog eye, leaf spot. What about in lower yielding environments? Well, I'll just show you some data. Every year we test a bunch of foliar fungicide products and look at their impact on yield and seed quality. Here are 3 sites from this year. We actually did quite a bit of this in Edgecombe County, but not presenting that data today, but we had something more near y'all. Sampson County, Union County, Yadkin County. Okay, here is a lower yielding site. This is a lower yielding site for us. And we had foliar disease pressure and foliar fungicides on average across all the products we looked at protected yield by 15 bushels per acre. So this is a production practice that's important in high yield environments and important in low yield environments. We use a variety that was susceptible to frog eye leaf spot. We had the disease pressure. It matters in both types of yield environments. So I kind of want to just talk about some takeaways from high yield environments and low yield environments before we talk about the tool. So if you looked at this data, if you looked at the producer-derived data or small plot data, if you're in a high yield environment, maturity group 5 or earlier perform more optimally in high yielding environments in high production, early planting situations. I would say in general, if you looked at the data, planting before mid-April is less problematic in high yield environments where you have the conditions to help push vegetative growth early in the season than it is in lower yielding environments. Just as mentioned, robust foliar disease management is important in high yield situation. It's also important in a lower yield situation. So if you look at our data in lower yielding situations, we generally cut that off around 50 bushels, 60 bushels per acre. The lower yielding situations we've seen maturity group 5 through 7 perform more optimally. We've seen it be very problematic to plant before mid-April in those more stressful environments. And we've seen a place for later maturing varieties in those earlier planting situations if you're shifting there, as well as continued robust foliar disease management is critical. So I would say those are some broad generalizations, but we'd like to get more detailed with those recommendations. And why? It's because you guys, I made you look at these graphs. I'm hoping after looking at these for the past 5 years, you'll forgive me when we release this tool. That's a better way to look at this data. We need a better way. And so we've been working at NC State with the Plant Sciences Initiative and the Data Science Academy to put a computer engineering student on this project using all this field data, which has been generated by the soybean producers, to help develop this tool. And I'll tell you what the tool is going to do in a minute, but where we're at is we've beta tested it with a lot of extension agents and growers across the state, and we're working on making this tool function more optimally for your production situation. So it won't look exactly like this. We have a lot of improvements to make, but essentially what you'll do is you're going to drop a pin on this map of where you are in North Carolina. And it's going to take that pin, it's going to look at historical yields from our plots, it's going to look at where you are in the state, latitude, for example. And it's going to make a prediction on what your best planting date window is to use at that location. And once you know your planting date, you can predict what's the best maturity group to use, what's the best seeding rate to use, and you can kind of manipulate all those variables. But this is what we're hoping will be a tool that growers can use to make data-driven decisions about these production practices in North Carolina. And so I just wanted to spice things up towards the end of this lecture. And you can't run the tool yet because it's not publicly available. But if you were to run the tool, I want you to pick the numerically highest optimum soybean planting date for the northern coastal plain. And whoever gets the closest is going to get a Yeti cup. If the first person gets to pick if you want red or black. So the numerically highest planting date for the northern coastal plain. So just raise your hands, and that way we can, not everybody shouting at once. Using this tool, we generated the optimum planting window. What do you think the optimum planting date was? Okay, April 25th. April 15th. Okay, April 16th.
May 2nd in the afternoon.
Okay, May 2nd in the afternoon. Anybody else?
April 20th.
Okay, anybody else?
April 1st. April 30th.
Okay.
May 5th.
May 5th. All right, anybody else?
April 8th.
Okay, we got a wide range of planting dates out. So when we use this tool and drop the pin on the map, the optimum planting period for this northern coastal plain location was April 16th to May 30th. So that's wider than some of the optimum planting windows we see elsewhere. But I think we've got some lower yield environments out here, which is driving that. And if you looked at the numerically highest planting date within that window, it was May 14th. So whoever was closest to that can get the Yeti, which I think, who said May 5th? All right, Desmond, I don't know if you and DJ were doing any trade-in back there. I'm just kidding. So, but that was the optimum planting window within 5 bushels per acre of the top yield. There were numerically higher yields, but that window was in 5 bushels per acre of the top yield. Now, we have another Yeti cup to raffle off, and so within that planting window, we looked for what was the optimum maturity group. And we have a range, but if you had to pick the relative maturity, let's say, this is not going to be it, but what we're looking for like a 2.6 or an 8.1, the relative maturity, not the maturity group. What relative maturity do you think numerically optimized yield in that planting window?
4.8.
Okay, 4.8? 4.6? Okay.
5.4.
All right, I'm going to need, I haven't figured out how we're going to deal with a tiebreaker. It's somewhere between what's been said. All right, so the optimum planting range here was, or the maturity group range was 4.3 to 5.9. In that planting window, those are maturity groups that were within 5 bushels per acre of the top. Specifically, it was maturity group 4.7, so pretty close to Winslow, so he can get the cup there. And I just wanted to kind of highlight what this tool is going to do. And it's depending on where you're at on the map, these things will change slightly. It depends what your production practices are here. But this is what this tool will do. And then an additional functionality is we'll be able to predict what the optimum seeding rate is to use from a revenue perspective, not just a yield perspective. So this will be released on April 1st. So we hope you can use it to at least make planting date decisions and seeding rate decisions for this coming season. We realize you're going to have already booked your seed, likely. So just to recap here, the objectives of this presentation were to deep dive into some of the important agronomic considerations for soybeans. I hope you have a better understanding of some of the important planting date considerations and maturity group considerations, how those differ or don't differ in yield environments. And then finally, I wanted to highlight that we are going to have a tool that will be released later this spring that's based on a lot of data to help you make more robust decisions about those important production practices. So at that point, I just want to thank the team of individuals that help execute all this small plot research that you heard about throughout the day, and happy to take questions if I've got any time.
Dr. Dunphy was never very big on seed treatment plant soybeans. He never thought it really would pay for itself. With more emphasis being put on early varieties and earlier planting, do you think that has changed now?
Yeah, it's a good question. So what are the seed treatment needs right now for soybeans in North Carolina? So we have done some more recent data on that. There's a lot of different seed treatments you could use in soybeans, and I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'll talk about fungicides and I'll talk about insecticidal seed treatments. From a fungicide seed treatment perspective, we've done recent research with early planting dates and earlier maturing varieties, and we've found that if you're planting before mid-May, it pays to both protect stand and yield from using a fungicidal seed treatment. In these earlier planting conditions, some of our pathogens are intensified by cool, wet conditions. Actually, some are intensified by hot conditions, but we've seen in small plot data that you need a fungicidal seed treatment before you're planting, if you're planting before mid-May, and using an earlier maturing variety. And I would say that's likely the case for later maturing varieties, although our research was on 3s, 4s, and 5s, which are earlier maturing. Insecticidal seed treatments in soybeans. Our colleague, Dr. Dominic Reising, who you likely know well, are one of our row crop entomologists, has done a lot of work, even in early planting situations, on the need for an insecticidal seed treatment in North Carolina soybean production, and it's never found an implication on yield from using an insecticidal seed treatment. It can kill early season insects, but has found no yield implications from using insecticidal seed treatments. There's also additional issues besides wasting money of using an insecticidal seed treatment in soy when you don't need it, and that is to intensify pest resistance for cotton and corn where you do need the insecticidal seed treatment. So our current recommendations based on data are to use a fungicidal seed treatment with mid-May planting or earlier. I think we got some more work to do in the double crop situations, but we have a new pathologist here, Dr. Leanne Lusk, who's going to be doing some of that work. Insecticidal seed treatments, still no data to show that those impact soybean yield in North Carolina.
Okay, any other quick questions for Dr. Vann?
Have you noticed much difference between determinate and indeterminate things like early groups?
Thank you. That is a great question. Have you noticed any differences between indeterminate and determinate soybeans? Yes, there are important agronomic differences, and that is kind of a next phase of research for our program. We're doing a lot more work with indeterminate and determinate varieties, particularly focusing on like the MG5 area where you're going to see overlapping growth habits within that maturity group. But I do think it is important, and there's a lot of interactions about where it's important. What is your planting date? For example, our team planted a 5-7 indeterminate last week of April across much of the state this year, and it was a disaster because they got tall, they lodged, they had very thick stems. And so there can be both positive and negative yield implications of using the certain growth habits in certain environments, and I do think it's an important consideration that we're investigating, and not only in high yield environments, but we're doing more work now in double crop situations, July planting situations about those growth habits, and happy to chat more. Okay, Billy's kicking me off the stage. I'll be here through the rest of the soybean school. Thanks.